The Patterson house was quiet in the early morning haze, the sun just beginning to peek over the pine-covered hills behind their backyard. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee and watching the mist curl across the grass. Her husband, Mark, sat at the table flipping through the local paper, still groggy from sleep. Upstairs, their 15-year-old son, Jake, was already lacing up his running shoes. He had always been an early riser, something Sarah had never quite gotten used to. Jake was a regular teenager in most ways, loved video games, occasionally groaned at homework, and rarely remembered to clean his room. But he had one passion that set him apart: running. Cross-country was his thing, and the upcoming regional qualifiers were all he could think about. He trained like a pro, even if he wasn't one yet. Max, their loyal golden retriever, was his daily running companion. They were inseparable. "Going now," Jake called out, jogging down the stairs with Max trailing close behind, tail wagging. "Be back in an hour," Sarah said automatically, not looking up from her mug. Mark gave a small wave from behind the newspaper. "Stick to the trail?" Jake nodded, grabbed a granola bar, and was out the door before another word could be said. Max barked once as if to say, "Let's go," and together, boy and dog disappeared into the morning. The trail behind their house wound through a thicket of trees and led to a well-worn path local joggers used. Jake had run it hundreds of times. He knew the turns, the way the light hit through the trees, where the rocks jutted out dangerously. That morning, nothing seemed different. The birds sang their usual songs. The forest smelled like dew and moss. Jake felt good, strong, fast. Max trotted beside him, occasionally darting ahead, ears perked for squirrels or deer. That was the last time anyone saw Jake Patterson. When Max returned an hour later, he was alone. Sarah was loading the dishwasher when she heard the scratching at the back door. She opened it with a smile. "Good boy, Max. Where's Jake?" But her smile faded instantly. Max's paws were caked with mud. There were burrs tangled in his fur and a long scratch across his snout. He was panting heavily, wide-eyed, pacing in circles, looking behind him as if expecting Jake to come through the trees. "Jake!" Sarah stepped outside, calling into the backyard. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently. Mac barked twice, nervously. Then he ran to the edge of the woods, turned to look back at her, and barked again. Sarah's heart stuttered. "Mark!" she called louder this time. "Something's wrong." Within minutes, Mark was outside too, his expression already clouded with dread. They tried calling Jake's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They yelled his name, loud and long, into the trees. No response. Panic crept in quickly. They called the neighbors, hoping he might have looped through another yard. No one had seen him. They drove up and down the nearest roads. Mark even ran down the trail himself, shouting until his voice cracked. An hour turned into 3. Police were called. A search was launched. Volunteers came with flashlights, dogs, walkie-talkies. Max was frantic, tugging his leash, trying to lead the searchers deeper into the woods. Night fell. Still no sign of Jake. Sarah sat on the porch steps as darkness swallowed the yard. Her hands trembled. Max laid at her feet, restless and whimpering. And Jake never came home. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Jake Patterson's disappearance had already gripped the small town of Alder Creek. The wooded trails that once felt peaceful now loomed like a dark maze, hiding secrets no one could yet see. Police cars lined the cul-de-sac in front of the Patterson home, and uniformed officers moved briskly between neighbors, notepads in hand, questions pouring from their lips. Did you hear anything unusual? Had Jake mentioned feeling unsafe? Any changes in behavior lately? Mark stood with arms folded across his chest as a detective ran through a checklist. Sarah sat on the porch, her eyes red and swollen, barely responding unless directly spoken to. And Max, Jake's devoted golden retriever, paced back and forth, restless and agitated. He whined at the forest's edge and barked at the trees like he expected them to answer. Soon, the official search was underway. Volunteers from across the county arrived, scouts, hikers, retired veterans. They brought maps, drones, and determination. The local fire department set up a base station. The sound of radio chatter buzzed through the trees as search lines formed and spread out through the dense woods. Max, ever loyal, tugged on his leash until one officer decided to follow his lead. He darted through the underbrush, pulling the man toward a small ravine deeper into the forest. He stopped abruptly at a muddy patch near a fallen tree and began to dig furiously, whimpering as his paws scraped the earth. Searchers gathered. They cleared brush, combed the area for evidence, anything that might point to Jake. But there was nothing. No clothing, no phone, no blood, just mud, pine needles, and silence. The ravine was marked and logged, but without further clues, they had to keep moving. Max was leashed again. He resisted at first, turning again and again to look at the tree, but he was pulled away. Days passed. Theories began to swirl. Was it a runaway? Jake had seemed happy, but teenagers could be good at hiding things. Had he left on purpose? An accident? The terrain was rough in places. Maybe he'd slipped into a hidden crevice or fallen into the river. Or something worse. Abduction, though rare in small towns like Alder Creek, could not be ruled out. The thought chilled every parent to the bone. Detectives combed through Jake's online life, his school locker, his friends' accounts. Nothing suspicious emerged. He hadn't packed a bag. His wallet and money were still in his room. There were no signs of planning. Then the story hit the news. Teen vanishes during morning run in Alder Creek. Dog returns alone. Search continues. Parents plead for son's safe return. Cameras flashed outside the Patterson home. News vans parked along the street. Sarah and Mark, exhausted but desperate, stood on their porch and begged for help. "If you've seen anything, please call the police," Sarah said into the microphones, her voice breaking. "We just want our son home." Mark placed a protective arm around her. "He's a good kid. He doesn't deserve this." Despite the media attention and the outpouring of support, no new leads emerged. Every inch of the trail was searched and researched. The lake was dragged. Helicopters scanned from above. Still, Jake remained a ghost. And every night, without fail, Max walked slowly to Jake's bedroom door, circled 3 times, and laid down on the rug outside. His nose pressed to the frame, his eyes on the handle. Waiting, just waiting. Hope is a dangerous thing. It lifts you up just enough to see the light before it drops you hard. For Sarah and Mark Patterson, hope began to flicker again when the first call came in 5 days after Jake disappeared. "I saw him," the woman said breathlessly. "I swear I did. He was walking along Highway 17 near the old diner. Looked tired, dirty, but it was him." Police moved fast. That stretch of road was less than 10 miles from the trailhead where Jake had gone missing. Officers canvassed the area, checking with gas stations, stores, and truck stops. One clerk at a roadside convenience store said a boy matching Jake's description had come in late the night before, bought water, and left quickly. Surveillance footage was pulled. Sarah and Mark were called to the station. They sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping each other's hands as the grainy video played. The timestamp matched the witness account. The boy was about Jake's height, wearing a dark hoodie and running shoes. For a moment, Sarah forgot how to breathe. But then the boy turned toward the camera, and the illusion shattered. His face was different. Similar, but not Jake. Too thin. Eyes the wrong shape. The officers slowed the footage, zoomed in, played it again. It wasn't him. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Mark rubbed his forehead. A flash of frustration breaking through his sadness. False lead. It wasn't the last. Over the next several weeks, more sightings came in. A boy on a bus. A teen sleeping behind a warehouse. A hitchhiker in Oregon. Each report brought a fresh burst of adrenaline, and then despair. Every face turned out to belong to someone else. Some were harmless cases of mistaken identity. Others were cruel pranks, kids calling in fake tips for laughs. The pressure began to wear on Sarah and Mark. They clung to each other during press conferences, supported each other through sleepless nights. But behind closed doors, tension crept in. Conversations became sharp. Silences grew longer. Grief has a way of finding cracks and widening them. "I'm not giving up," Sarah said one night, staring out the window. "I never said you were," Mark replied, but his voice lacked conviction. They still shared the same bed, but it felt colder. Like the empty space where Jake should have been was spreading between them, slowly taking over the house. Meanwhile, Max's behavior grew stranger. He no longer slept through the night. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, he would start to pace the hallway, whining softly. Then came the howling, long, mournful, guttural cries that echoed through the walls. Sarah tried comforting him. "Sure, baby. It's okay. We're still looking." But Max didn't stop. His ears were alert, nose twitching, like he sensed something that no one else could. Then one morning, after another fruitless tip and another dead end, the police returned. Back to the woods. Back to the last place Jake had been seen. Back to the silence that swallowed him whole. There were no new leads, no new technology, just a lingering question and the echo of Max's nightly cries. The forest still held its secrets, and the search wasn't over. Time moved on, even if the Patterson family couldn't. The search parties grew smaller, the headlines faded, and eventually, the case went cold. There were no more press conferences, no more late-night phone calls or distant sightings to chase. The town quietly tucked Jake Patterson's disappearance into its shadowed past, an open wound that stopped bleeding but never healed. For Sarah and Mark, the silence was louder than any siren. Mark withdrew into himself. The man who had once fixed everything from leaky faucets to Jake's science fair volcano stopped talking. He went through the motions, work, meals, mowing the lawn, but his laughter disappeared. His eyes no longer lit up. He no longer spoke Jake's name. Sarah, however, refused to give up. She kept Jake's room exactly as it had been that morning. Posters still lined the walls. Trophies and running shoes still sat on the shelf. Every year on his birthday, she baked his favorite chocolate cake. Every year on the day he vanished, she lit a candle and placed it on the porch. She emailed detectives every 6 months, checked online forums, missing persons boards, and local reports like it was her religion. She never stopped hoping. Not for a second. And then there was Max. The golden retriever had grown slower with age. His once bright coat dulled with streaks of gray. His legs stiffened in winter, and he could no longer chase birds or leap fences like he used to. But one thing never changed. Every morning, just after sunrise, Max would go to the back door and scratch gently. When Sarah opened it, he would hobble down the steps and trot toward the edge of the woods. He would stop, look back at her, then disappear into the trees, always toward the same trail, always the same direction Jake had gone. At first, Sarah had tried to follow, but Max always outran her. And he always returned an hour later, panting and tired, his eyes clouded but determined. Neighbors called it a habit. Sarah called it faith. Years passed. The seasons cycled through their colors. Leaves turned gold, snow fell, flowers bloomed, and still Jake never came home. Most people assumed he was gone. A tragedy, a mystery, a boy lost to the woods. But Sarah didn't bury her son, not in her heart. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, 9 years, 2 months, And 14 days after Jake vanished, a stranger stepped onto that same forest trail. He was a hiker, a traveler passing through Alder Creek. His boots crunched against leaves, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He'd heard the trail was beautiful this time of year, a quiet escape from the noise of city life. He didn't know the history, didn't know the stories whispered about a missing boy and his loyal dog. He walked deeper into the woods, breathing in pine and silence. And just as he rounded a bend near the old ravine, a sound stopped him cold. Low, rough barking, urgent, desperate, from an old, gray-muzzled retriever. Alone, tugging at something buried beneath the brush. Dylan Hayes had no idea what he was walking into when he arrived in Alder Creek. He was 26, a freelance travel writer looking for quiet corners of the world to hike, camp, and clear his head. After a stressful year and too many nights spent scrolling headlines and chasing deadlines, Dylan was craving trees instead of screens, the sound of wind instead of traffic. He'd read about the forest trails just outside Alder Creek, uncharted enough to feel wild, but close enough to town to be safe. It was exactly what he needed. He parked at the edge of the woods, laced up his boots, slung his pack over his shoulder, and stepped out into the chilly morning air. It smelled of moss, damp earth, and something ancient. The leaves crunched beneath his feet as he started along the winding trail. That's when he saw the dog. An old golden retriever stood about 10 yards ahead, watching him. Dylan paused. "Hey there, buddy. You lost." The dog didn't bark, didn't run, just turned and walked a few paces down the path, then stopped and looked back. Dylan chuckled. "What? You wanted to follow you." The dog took another few steps. Looked back again. His eyes were cloudy, but there was something urgent in his posture, something that tugged at Dylan's gut. Curious, he kept walking. The dog, Max, led him deeper into the trees, always just a few feet ahead. Occasionally, Max would stop, sniff the air, and look over his shoulder as if to make sure Dylan was still behind him. After about 10 minutes, the trail narrowed. Trees grew denser. The sunlight barely broke through. The silence was thick, broken only by bird song and the occasional rustle of wind. Then, without warning, Max froze. His ears perked, nose to the air. And then he bolted. "Whoa! Hey!" Dylan shouted, stumbling forward. The old dog sprinted with surprising speed into the underbrush, veering off the path and into the darker part of the forest. Dylan hesitated for a split second, then adjusted his pack and ran after him. Branches scratched at his arms. Mud sucked at his boots. He ducked under limbs, leapt over roots. The forest here felt older, untouched. Finally, he spotted Max, standing still in a narrow clearing at the base of a massive oak tree. The tree looked like it had stood for centuries, thick-limbed and silent, its bark rough like armor. Moss crept up its roots like veins. Max sniffed the ground furiously, then began to paw at the earth, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Dirt flew. Clumps of dead leaves scattered. Dylan approached slowly, heart thudding. "What is it, boy?" Max let out a low, throaty bark, then returned to digging. Dylan squatted beside him, unsure if the dog had found a squirrel burrow or a long-lost toy, but the expression on Max's face was too intense for something so small. And then Dylan saw something beneath the dirt. Not fur, not bone, but fabric. A torn, sun-faded piece of black nylon. And just beneath it, something that shimmered in the faint light. Metal. Dylan crouched beside the base of the massive oak, his pulse roaring in his ears. His hands trembled as he brushed away more dirt, revealing the outline of something buried deep beneath years of soil and time. The fabric was dark, weathered, torn in places, and clung to fragments of what looked like a shirt. Threads broke apart between his fingers. Next to it, worn-out rubber, cracked and frayed. the sole of a running shoe. Dylan's breath caught in his throat. He dug more carefully now, not sure whether to keep going or run. And then, half buried under roots and stone, he found it. A backpack. It was small, caked in mud, and nearly unrecognizable, except for one detail. A faded blue patch on the back, shaped like a lightning bolt. The kind of teenager might stitch on for fun. Dylan pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed emergency services. "This is going to sound strange," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I think I found something human. Clothing. A backpack. I followed a dog out into the forest, and he led me straight to it." The dispatcher's voice turned sharp. "Stay where you are. We're sending officers and a search unit immediately. Can you give us your GPS coordinates?" Within the hour, the forest was alive with movement. Police tape, dogs, investigators in gloves, and boots moving carefully around the site. Dylan sat off to the side, pale and shaken, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Max lay next to him, exhausted but calm, as if he had known this moment would come all along. Detectives combed through the disturbed soil with forensic precision. Every uncovered item was bagged, labeled, and photographed. Bits of clothing, what remained of a sneaker, and the backpack. The same backpack Jake Patterson had worn on his morning run 9 years ago. There was no doubt. Inside the pack, they found a broken water bottle, a school-issued sports band with the name Jake still faintly visible, and a cracked phone case, its surface faded but intact. Detective Moore, who had worked the case from the start, stood silent for a long moment before picking up the radio. "Give me the Pattersons," he said quietly. "Tell them we found something." Back in Alder Creek, Sarah Patterson was doing dishes when the phone rang. She knew before she picked it up. A stillness filled the kitchen, the kind that only grief or truth can bring. Mark appeared in the doorway, sensing something. She held up a trembling hand. The detective's voice came through, low and steady. "Mrs. Patterson, we believe we've found Jake's backpack near the old ravine trail. A hiker in Max led him to it." Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, her legs refusing to hold her. Her hand gripped the edge of the wood like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. Mark moved to her side, slowly sinking into the chair across from her. They didn't speak for several minutes. Jake's backpack. After all these years, the forest was no longer silent. Yellow tape stretched between the trees like a terrible web, and a mobile command center buzzed just off the trail. Forensic teams in white suits moved carefully, tools in hand, as the place that had once swallowed a boy began, piece by piece, to give him back. The case of Jake Patterson, cold for 9 long years, was officially reopened. The site was treated like a crime scene now, not just a burial ground. Each clump of earth was sifted with care. Every artifact, buttons, zippers, even a rusted keychain, was bagged and logged. They found more fragments of clothing and, eventually, what they had feared and expected: bones, scattered and partially buried near the roots of the great oak. Time and nature had done their cruel work, but there was enough for identification. A small gold molar cap, a heel fracture in the left arm, and DNA carefully extracted and tested. It was Jake. There was no longer any doubt. When the call came, Sarah and Mark sat side by side on the living room couch, holding hands like they used to when they first fell in love. Their eyes were hollow, dry from too many tears cried long ago. "There's no easy way to say this," the detective said gently, "but we've confirmed it. The remains, they belong to your son." Mark bowed his head. Sarah just nodded. "Thank you for not giving up," she whispered. "Thank you for letting us know." It wasn't closure. It didn't feel like peace. But it was truth. And truth, even when it breaks your heart, is something you can hold. They were no longer trapped in limbo. But then, just as the grief began to settle into something heavy and still, a new kind of tension entered the room. Detectives found something that didn't add up. Jake's injuries didn't all match a fall or an accident. His backpack was too far from his final resting place. And most chilling of all, one of his sneakers still had the laces tied, pristine, as if someone had removed it after death. There were no broken bones consistent with a steep fall, no signs of animal disturbance. In fact, many of the skeletal remains have been protected, hidden deliberately under thick brush and disturbed earth. Someone had placed him there, and someone had not wanted him to be found. The detective's voice on the phone returned days later, this time with a tone of grim clarity. "Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Patterson, I need to be honest with you. This doesn't look like an accident. We're treating Jake's death as suspicious, possibly criminal." The world tilted all over again. Jake hadn't simply gone for a run and lost his way. Someone had made sure he never came home. The bones told a story, and it wasn't one of a boy who simply got lost in the woods. The forensic report was clinical, but its contents hit like a hammer. Multiple broken ribs, a hairline fracture across the left side of the skull, a healed injury on the right forearm. Older, unrelated, but the rest, the experts agreed, pointed something else. Jake had suffered blunt force trauma before his death. Maybe not immediately fatal, but violent. Something or someone had struck him hard, enough to leave marks that still lingered on his skeleton nearly a decade later. Detective Moore stood in the middle of the forest clearing, looking around with new eyes. "This wasn't a fall," he muttered to his partner. "It was a fight, or worse." Theories came quickly, too many at once. A stranger in the woods? A predator lurking in the trees? But the scene didn't fit a random attack. Jake's belongings, especially the backpack, were found a good 20 yards from where his body had been hidden. Someone had moved him, someone who knew the area. Back at the station, Moore spread out Jake's old social circle across the whiteboard. Teammates, classmates, neighbors, friends. The focus shifted inward. Who had seen Jake last? Who knew his running route? Who had something to hide? Sarah Patterson sat through another round of interviews, her voice steadier than expected. "I remember that day too clearly," she said. "He left at 6:30. He always ran the same trail, and we reported him missing by 8. The entire neighborhood helped us look." She paused, her brow furrowed. "Except," she turned to the detective, "there was one person we didn't see that morning. He always showed up when things happened. Every barbecue, every school fundraiser. He was everywhere, until Jake went missing." Detective Moore leaned in. "Who?" Sarah looked at her hands. "Daniel Keene, Jake's old track coach. He lived just 2 streets over. He trained all the kids in the neighborhood for free. Everyone loved him." Mark, sitting beside her, spoke quietly. "But after that day, it's like he vanished. Didn't help with the search. Didn't call. Didn't show up to offer support. Just gone." Moore's mind raced. Keene had been in his late 30s back then. Friendly. Involved. He remembered his name from the original file. Listed briefly. Never flagged. Now he wondered why. And that's when things shifted. 9 years ago, a boy disappeared. And in that very same moment, a man quietly slipped out of sight. While detectives re-examined Jake's social circle, one name surfaced again: Charles Danner, the reclusive neighbor who lived just 3 houses down from the Pattersons. He had always kept to himself. No wife, no children. He barely nodded at neighbors. But what people remembered most was his daily ritual: long, solitary walks through the forest trails, sometimes before sunrise, sometimes long after dark. When Jake disappeared, Charles had been briefly questioned. He claimed to have seen nothing unusual. No one followed up. There was no evidence, no motive, just a quiet man who said very little and returned to his life. But now, With the case reopened and new details coming to light, Detective Moore decided to take a second look. That's when something strange came up. Charles Danner had moved out of town just 4 days after Jake vanished. Sold his modest house fast, packed his belongings, and relocated to a remote corner of northern Oregon. No social media, no phone records, no visits back. It didn't prove anything, but it didn't look good either. Moore requested a deeper background check, and there it was, a sealed juvenile record. Details hidden, but the file showed a history of aggression in his teens. An old assault charge, counseling required. No adult offenses, no convictions, but the pattern raised questions. The team combed through maps and photos of the area from 9 years ago. That's when they noticed something else, a hidden footpath behind Danner's house. Locals had called it the back path. Unofficial, unmarked. Kids used it to sneak through the woods, unnoticed. Jake could have known about it, maybe used it that morning. And inside the faded remains of Jake's backpack, just found days earlier, forensics had uncovered a note, smudged and water-warped, but 2 words were still visible. Back path. A coincidence? Or a dying clue? Meanwhile, the suspicion around Coach Daniel Keene hadn't faded. 2 men, 2 missing faces from that fateful day. Now, the case no longer had one shadow. It had 2, and both of them might be hiding something. The excavation site near the old oak tree had been cleared and documented. Investigators had already recovered bones, fragments of clothing, and the tattered remains of Jake's backpack. But just when they thought the scene was fully processed, another discovery changed everything. A sharp glint in the dirt caught the attention of a forensic technician working near the edge of the dig. About 6 inches beneath the surface, buried beneath damp soil and roots, lay a rusted but intact hunting knife. The blade was dull from time and oxidation, but the handle, dark wood with a brass end cap, was remarkably well preserved. It had been wrapped in layers of decaying cloth, likely from the original backpack, almost as if someone had tried to hide it or protect it. The site was immediately shut down. The knife was tagged, photographed, and rushed to the lab. No one said it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Could this be the murder weapon? It took 2 days to run the prints. When the results came back, Detective Moore stared at the report in silence. One partial fingerprint had survived on the brass end of the handle. It wasn't Jake's. It wasn't the coach's. It was Charles Danner's, the reclusive neighbor who'd vanished days after Jake did. The man with a sealed record. The man who claimed to know nothing. His print, faint but legally viable, was now tied to a knife found just feet from Jake's shallow grave. No more speculation. No more hunches. Now, they had something real. Detective Moore issued a nationwide alert for Charles Danner. Patrols were notified. Federal agents brought in. His last known address was checked. Surveillance initiated. After 9 long years of silence, the hunt had finally begun. The address came through late at night. A cabin on the outskirts of Sisters, Oregon, nestled deep in the pines, far from neighbors, far from questions. That's where Charles Danner had ended up. A small team of investigators made the trip, 2,000 miles across the country, to knock on a weather-worn door and look into the eyes of the man who had once walked daily through the woods where a boy disappeared. Charles opened the door calmly. A gray beard now softened the sharp edges of his face, but the same quiet, unreadable expression remained. He didn't try to run, didn't slam the door. He let them in. Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse. No signs of children. No personal photos, just books, canned food, and a hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace. Detective Moore led the conversation. They asked about Jake, about the neighborhood, about the woods. Charles answered everything with caution. He said he remembered the boy, remembered hearing about the disappearance. Said it had been a tragedy that shook the town. But then came the questions about the knife. His eyes didn't flinch when they mentioned it, but his answers began to drift. First, he said he'd never owned one. Then he said he had, but lost it years ago. Then he said he might have sold it, might have dropped it on a hike. Details changed. The truth thinned. And far away, back in Alder Creek, another quiet shift was happening. Max, the aging dog who had waited 9 years, was failing. His joints stiffened. His eyes clouded. He stopped eating. The Patterson home turned quiet, eerily so. He still dragged himself to Jake's bedroom door each night, still laid down beside it, as if guarding it, as if listening, as if waiting. And though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. Max was holding on for something, and time was running out. The interview room was small and windowless, lit only by a buzzing fluorescent panel overhead. Charles Danner sat at the table, hands folded, eyes low. For hours, he had dodged questions, offered vague answers, and blamed the past for his broken memory. But the evidence was too precise. The knife, the fingerprint, the hidden footpath behind his house, and the note in Jake's ruined backpack that read, "Backpath." Detectives circled him slowly, their voices calm, deliberate. They didn't shout. They didn't accuse. They just waited. And then it cracked. Charles leaned back in the metal chair, allowed a long, exhausted breath, and spoke the words no one expected to hear. "He startled me. That's all. I didn't mean to. I didn't plan it." He said he had gone for his usual morning walk through the woods. A ritual. His escape. Jake must have been running the trail behind his house, headphones in. They crossed paths unexpectedly. Charles claimed Jake said something rude, something mocking, something that made the anger rise. It was just a second where I couldn't take it. I pushed him. Jake fell, hit his head against a root, laid still. Panic overtook reason. Charles waited, hoping the boy would get up, but he didn't. So Charles dragged the body deeper into the woods, buried it beneath loose soil, covered it with brush, took the backpack and knife, hid them. I thought no one would ever find him. He never told anyone, never returned to the spot, just packed up his life and left town. The confession was recorded, every word logged, every pause heavy with the weight of guilt. Back in Alder Creek, Jake's parents listened to the tape in silence. Not a sob, not a whisper. They held hands, faces pale, eyes blank. It wasn't closure. Not really. It was just a version of the truth, finally spoken out loud. And as they sat in that quiet room, both of them thought the same thing. It wasn't Charles who uncovered the truth. It was Max, the dog who never stopped believing his boy would come home. The morning came gray and still. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and distant rain. A hush hung over the Patterson house, as if the world itself had paused. Max, the golden Rottweiler who had once bounded through these woods beside a boy full of dreams, could barely lift his head. He hadn't eaten in days. His legs trembled when he tried to stand. Breathing had become an effort, labored and uneven. But when Sarah Patterson, Jake's mother, knelt beside him with his old leash in her hands and whispered, "Let's go, sweetheart, just once more," Max pushed himself to his feet. Slowly they stepped outside. Neighbors saw them as they passed, some standing in doorways, others by fences, silent. No one said a word. They knew where Sarah was taking him, and they knew why. The trail behind the Patterson home had once been a place of laughter, of early morning runs and muddy paws. It had also become the last known path Jake ever walked. Max, frail but determined, moved slowly beside Sarah. His once powerful frame now leaned gently against her leg. But his eyes were clear, focused. He remembered the way. Sarah didn't rush him. She spoke softly, her hand on his back. "You brought him home, Max. You stayed. You waited for us. You gave us the truth. They reached the clearing. The oak tree stood there, ancient and still, watching over the spot where secrets had slept for nearly a decade. The ground bore marks of recent digging, now slowly being claimed again by the forest. Max stepped forward, tail low, head bowed. Then he laid down beside the roots, right at the place where Jake had waited all those years. Sarah knelt beside him, resting a trembling hand on his thick, golden fur. He looked at her once, just once, as if to say, "I did my job." And then he closed his eyes. His chest rose, fell, and stilled. Max had waited long enough. 9 years of loyalty, 9 years of silence, 9 years of hope. And now, with his boy finally found, he could rest. They'd buried Max on a Saturday. The sky was clear, as if the heavens themselves had parted to honor him. The sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light over the clearing near the old oak, the place where he had made his final stand. Sarah and Mark Patterson stood quietly, hand in hand, as neighbors, friends, and even strangers from nearby towns gathered. Word had spread, not just about Jake, but about the dog who had waited, watched, believed. Someone had brought a framed photo of Max from years ago, tongue out, muddy paws, bright eyes. Others brought flowers, notes, hand-drawn sketches from local children who'd grown up hearing whispers of the boy who vanished and the dog who never stopped searching. No one had expected a crowd this large. But then again, no one could deny what Max had done. Sarah stepped forward first, her voice calm, though her hands shook. "We lost Jake, and for a long time, we lived in the silence of not knowing. But Max never gave up. He brought our son back to us. He gave us peace, and he reminded us what loyalty, love, and patience truly mean." The tears came freely now. Not just from the Pattersons, but from everyone. Even the police chief, who had led the original search and now stood by the tree in solemn respect. After the small service, the town unveiled a memorial plaque placed at the base of the oak tree. In honor of Max, guardian, seeker, hero. He never gave up. He never forgot. He brought Jake home. Sarah knelt one last time by the grave, her fingers brushing the edge of the soft earth. "Rest now, boy," she whispered. "You kept your promise." And as she rose, the forest seemed to sigh with her. Jake was finally at peace, and Max would never be forgotten. The house was quieter now. No scratching at the door. No sound of heavy paws on the floor. But in the silence, something had shifted. Not emptiness, just peace. Weeks passed, then months. Jake's room remained as it was, untouched, preserved. Not as a shrine, but as a memory, a symbol of what was lost and what had finally been found. But Sarah and Mark Patterson knew they couldn't let it end with just them. Not when so many others were still searching, waiting, hoping. And so, they created the Jake and Max Foundation. Its mission was simple and profound: to support the families of missing children, to fund search efforts, to provide trained tracking dogs, and to remind the world that sometimes miracles come on 4 legs and with a heart full of purpose. The first fundraiser was held in the town square. Over 200 people came. Some brought dogs. Others brought stories. All brought hope. And then, in front of cameras, microphones, and the quiet hush of a community still healing, Mark Patterson, the man who hadn't spoken publicly since Jake's disappearance, finally stepped forward. He held a small photo in his hand, Jake, muddy and grinning. Max, tongue lolling beside him. "I don't know if it was instinct," he began, voice steady but raw, "or love, or something else entirely. But Max never gave up. Not once. He remembered something we couldn't see. He waited until the very end to lead us back to our son. And because of him, we found the truth." He paused. "This foundation is our promise, that no family should face this alone, and no child should be forgotten." The crowd stood in silence, then slowly began to clap, not out of celebration, but in reverence. Later that evening, Sarah visited the oak tree once more. The wind whispered gently through the leaves. The memorial plaque caught the golden light of the setting sun. She placed a letter beneath the roots, a message sealed in plastic, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this place someday." Inside were two pictures, one of Jake, one of Max, and below them just one line, "A dog who never forgot, and the son found through loyalty." And somewhere just beyond the trees, it felt like Max was still keeping guard, still watching, still home.